Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Thursday plenary at the fourth and penultimate day of the 2021 Open Education Conference. We're going to be joined here by Dr. Reggie Raju, who will give us a keynote address in just a minute here. And we're absolutely thrilled to see such an international audience joining us today. And we hope that the conversation today will help facilitate cross-border connections about how we can make open education open for all. So the committee invited Dr. Raju here to speak to us in keeping with our theme for the conference, Making Open for All. And this theme, we really wanted to choose something that was both inspirational and aspirational, but that also recognized that there's a lot of work ahead to reach the ideal of all. When we think about openness, it's about enabling everyone everywhere to fully participate in sharing knowledge and recognizing that that's a universal human right. And yet there are many ways that our work isn't fully open. And for open systems to make the world truly a better place and live up to those ideals, we need to bake equity into the process and ensure that we're considering not just our own communities, but also the global community. So Dr. Raju is an expert coming from the open access publishing space. So the research, open access to research, which is a parallel and allied open movement. And within the SPARC organization, we often have conversations about how open access and open education are sort of siblings. There are many parallels and many ways that they connect, but slight differences. But in many ways, the open access, the arc of the open access movement is on a timeline that's a little bit ahead of our own. And there are many things that open education can learn from looking at how the open access movement has developed and consider ways that we can avoid some of the challenges and pitfalls and ways in which some parts of the open access movement are perhaps not open for all. And that will be an important theme that comes out of the conversation here today. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Reggie Raju, who is the Director of Research and Learning at the University of Cape Town Libraries in Cape Town, South Africa. He's been in academic libraries for more than 30 years and holds a PhD in information studies. He's the author of several publications in peer-reviewed national and international journals, chapters in books, and a book publication. His research focuses on librarianship with an emphasis on open access and library publishing. He's also a member of the Academic Research Libraries Standing Committee of IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations, as well as being the convener of IFLA's Special Interest Group on Library Publishing. And he's also currently the chair of SPARC Africa and is working to drive the social justice agenda for open access in Africa. So without further ado, Dr. Raju, please share your screen and take it away. Welcome. You'll need to unmute. Yes. It had to happen at some point during the conference.
Absolutely. Greetings to you all, and thank you so much, Nicole, for the introduction. I also want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to share my views on the theme making open for all. It is a disclaimer. I'm no expert on open education, but I am a very strong advocate for the broader openness movement. I would like to take a critical view of making open for all, demonstrating that much, and this is what Nicole has said, much needs to be done to achieve this. In responding to the challenges that have negatively influenced open access, I will draw on the University of Cape Town exemplar to demonstrate how dynamic, enriching, and liberating an OER can be. The open access movement was founded on a truly philanthropic purpose. And what I pull out from this is that it is a commitment to the bi-directional flow of information from the rich to the poor and the poor to the rich. The Budapest Declaration underscores the willingness of scientists and scholars to publish their research in scholarly journals. And the key word here, the key phrase here is without payment, for the sake of inquiry and knowledge. The reference of the declaration to the acceleration of research and the sharing of the learning of the rich with the poor and the poor with the rich affirms a movement with a philanthropic purpose. For the optimist like myself, one could confidently assume and envisage a movement that would mature and dismantle more than just financial and copyright barriers, or at the least, remain steadfast to the without payment commitment. I do not believe that it was unwarranted for many of us in Africa to view open access as a savior, bringing hope for the improved exchange of research output for the growth and development of the continent. However, that hope was dashed by the very founders of the movement, transitioned from a movement with a purpose, a social justice purpose, to a movement for a process. It was the movement for a purpose that gave hope. Unfortunately, it is the movement for a process that contributes to exclusion, contributes to elitism, to marginalization, and knowledge colonialism. The open access movement is leaning away. It is leaning away from making open for all towards making open for the elite. There is a need to shift the balance. The open access movement needs to recapture, it has to recapture the philanthropic underpinnings and return to a movement with a purpose. I would like to see the open access movement be guided by social justice principles. Herein lies my advocacy for equity and inclusion, and that is making open for all. To make open for all means recapturing that which has been lost to the oligarchy. I would like to share my interpretation of open access against the backdrop of the theme of the conference. The situatedness of the interventions conceptualized by the global north has and continues to have the opposite effect of bridging the information divide. For me, the concept open implies unobstructed, unhindered, or unrestricted. There are many that support the view that openness should contribute to global citizen empowerment. The notion of openness should bring it should bring change to society, provide sustainable solutions for bridging knowledge and digital divides in the society. It is this interpretation that gave the Global South hope in becoming a contributor. We have to become contributors to the world's knowledge production, not just consumers. Unfortunately, the focus on financial issues has detracted from the noble foundations of the movement and unintentionally created a new crisis. It has unintentionally created a new crisis, and that is then the entrenchment of the one-directional flow of research materials. The entrenchment of the global North dominated scholarly ecosystem, for me, promotes knowledge colonialism. Rob Johnson shared at the recent OASPA conference that open access has become an economic system. It has become an economic system for the dissemination of peer-reviewed outputs containing original research or scholarship immediately upon publication. Unfortunately, this economic system nullifies making open for all. I would like to articulate what making open for all means to me. In probing the concept, I would like to focus on the difference between equity and equality and draw a distinction between inclusion and exclusion. These two issues form the core of this presentation as they deny the possibility of making open for all. I'm certain that many of you would have debated the difference between equity and equality. However, I need to contextualize the difference in response to the need to advance equity before contemplating equality, as equality for me exacerbates the scholarly ecosystem divide. In an uneven scholarly ecosystem, equality consolidates. Equality consolidates marginalization. It consolidates exclusion, and it consolidates disenfranchisement. For me, to reach equality as an outcome, there is a need to confront the inequities within the research and scholarly landscape. To ensure that everyone is on the same page, my assertion is that equality is viewed as providing the same level of opportunity and assistance, while equity is providing various levels of support and assistance depending on specific needs. In South Africa, we refer it to as leveling the playing field. I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the South African environment. South Africa became a political democracy in 1994 after decades of colonialism, then apartheid. South Africa is one of the most progressive constitutions in the world with a wide range of guarantees, including the right to basic education. For me, this is an equality statement. Despite the progressive nature of the Constitution, the vestiges of apartheid still lingers on. Currently, there are 3 tiers of school education. These are not formal, but have evolved post the apartheid era, which gives one a sense of the inequities in the education system, despite And this is despite the progressive constitution. In the post-apartheid era, we have private schools. We have what is generally referred to as Model C schools. And these are schools that were created for the previously white students, the white population. And then there is those schools that are in townships or in rural areas. Now, I acknowledge that I am generalizing, but it is the principle or it is the message that I need to convey. Learners from the township schools, and here we're talking about here, these are the township schools. Learners from the township schools are taught to answer an examination paper. Learners from Model C schools, this area here, have a mixture of being taught to think and answer an examination paper, while learners from private schools, they are groomed to think. Learners from all three schools, schooling system, end up at the same university. They are in the same lecture halls and are expected to produce the same level of innovation and research. The question that I ask, is there opportunity for the openness movement to assist in leveling the playing field? And colleagues, I want you to keep these pictures at the back of your mind for the later part of the presentation. The difference here, let me talk about inclusion and exclusion. The difference between the concepts of equity and equality are much easier to articulate than the difference between exclusion and inclusion. Exclusion and inclusion are not binary concepts. It is my assertion that the current scholarly ecosystem has a slant towards consolidating marginalization, knowledge colonialism, and elitism. And I am also suggesting that a combination of conscious and unconscious biases is at the center of the skewed scholarly landscape, which excludes communities. Let me attempt to offer a simple distinction between exclusion and inclusion within the context of open access. Exclusion describes a state in which individuals are unable to participate fully in the scholarly ecosystem as they lack access to both information resources and forums for the dissemination of this scholarly output. And I think this is the important issue, where there is lack of forums for the dissemination of this scholarship. For me, the most significant issue is when participation is limited. People cannot voice their opinions or interact with each other. Their dignity and rights are compromised. As you could see, exclusion is more than material deprivation. There is the lack of control over important decisions, with the domino effect of a feeling of alienation and inferiority. Within the scholarly ecosystem, exclusion is both an outcome and a process. How do we reinforce inclusion with augmenting the goal with outcomes? Inclusion is viewed as the process of improving the conditions for participation in the scholarly ecosystem. It is both a a process, and a goal. I would like to posit that promoting inclusion requires tackling exclusion by removing. We have to remove barriers to participation. This inclusion demands deliberate steps to facilitate participation. The core elements in inclusion are empowerment and promotion. Inclusion processes require both addressing the drivers of exclusion, and that is policies and procedures, as well as discriminatory attitudes and behaviors. There is a need for the redistribution of power, status, and control over resources. There is a need to enrich inclusion through the addition of outcomes to goals. I would like to take a few minutes to show the symbiotic relationship between research and teaching and learning. This relationship is affirmed by a Stanford University president when he stated that, and I quote, "Research is part and parcel of the traditional university functions of teaching and learning." At UCT, there is a deliberate attempt to show the interconnectedness of research and teaching and learning. UCT holds the view that research must inform teaching. Research has to inform teaching. That is to say, and I quote, "All students must experience the importance of creating new knowledge." And that is the purpose of education, creating new knowledge, by virtue of the fact that their teachers infuse. The teachers have to infuse in their teaching the results of their research. To be a research-intensive institution implies that teaching must provide students with the requisite skills to undertake their own research and enrich their education. In a liberating and enriching education process, it is critical that the educator infuses research expertise into the facilitation or delivery of education. What I want to share via the graphic is that research informs teaching. Research output, be it a research article or an OER, and yes, OER is a research output. That the article and the other research outputs support the educational process. OER as information resources are an empowerment tool, promoting transformation, equity, and inclusion. For me, research is an intrinsic contributor to knowledge, development, and democracy. With teaching being the conduit to achieve this. There's a direct relationship between an informed and engaged citizenry and research and teaching and learning. It is my strong opinion that deaggregation is done to the detriment to the teaching and learning process as well as the research process. Let me move on to inclusionary interventions with exclusionary outcomes. There are interventions introduced by the Global North that are deemed to be progressive and destined to accelerate the move to open. However, and this is it, however, these interventions have inadvertently compounded exclusionary practices. This assertion is corroborated by Leslie Chan, who pointed out, and I quote, openness, when decontextualized from its historical and political roots, could become as exploitative and oppressive as the legacy system it seeks to displace. Taking a very pessimistic view, the interventions have exacerbated the scholarly communication divide. The optimism that the openness movement promised has not materialized for the Global South. And I'm also suggesting for marginalized communities within the Global North. The northernization of the publishing landscape has become more entrenched with the rollout of interventions that are meant to accelerate making open for all. I'm going to use the much lauded transformative agreements to demonstrate how a decontextualized intervention alienates and disenfranchises. These transformative agreements are based on the assumptions by the very protagonists of the openness movement that the conversion of the institution's subscription budget into an article processing charges budget will provide sufficient funding for the flip into a complete open stream. I need to say that the flipped model was developed. It was developed around article processing charges, which for me was an expanded business model introduced by publishers. No matter how much one embellishes the concept of APCs, for me, it is nothing more than the glorification of page fees. But what is guaranteed in this flip model is the continuation of profits for commercial publishers. In transformative agreements, there is a shift. There is a shift in prejudice from reading to publishing. The communities can now read the research, but they cannot publish their research because they cannot afford APCs. This pay-to-publish model shifts the accessibility problem from the end of the publication process to the beginning of the process. In essence, and this is where I bring in the Global South perspective, those without access to funds to pay publication fees are further disenfranchised. What has been done is that we have substituted paywalls with publication walls. And this is not my concept, it is well established in the literature. So let me talk to you about exclusionary practices. I earlier talked about conscious and unconscious bias. So let me do a little bit expanding here. There are well-meaning interventions that have unintended consequences. Then there are conscious and unconscious biases that have similar consequences, and that is the marginalization of African scholarship. I'm going to share how I'm going to share these biases to highlight exclusionary publishing practices. One of Africa's leading horticulturalists tried to publish her research in well-recognized international journals with very little success. She says that her manuscripts were, and I quote, not accepted, not because the research was not good, but because they regarded the crops I was writing about as weeds. For the African continent, the research has shown that African indigenous vegetables have a part to play in addressing three major problems in Africa: poverty, malnutrition, and food insecurity. So you could see the gatekeepers of the science. The gatekeepers of the science have a very situated interpretation of excellence in science. This researcher found an African open access journal and started publishing her findings. The improved visibility and accessibility of her research findings has influenced the Kenyan government in its development of nutritious feeding schemes for Kenyan schools. Other East African governments have also adopted these feeding schemes. What is significant is that the global North audience are now adopting these nutrition habits to balance their diets. I've shared with you the detractions to making open for all. I'm going to use the UCT publishing program to demonstrate how libraries can dismantle structures that perpetuate inequality and exclusionary practices. I'm going to use one publication, the Constitutional Law for Students, to show how we can reclaim the philanthropic underpinnings of the openness movement and champion the theme, making open for all. This is an OER that has and continues to have significant impact on teaching and learning and research. This Diamond Open Access publication, Diamond Open Access is basically where there is no payment by the reader nor the author. Okay, this publication addresses the issue of equity, an issue that I've been speaking about thus far, inclusion, development, and empowerment. It also brings to the fore the mainstreaming of scholarship. Constitutional law is considered one of the more complex subjects in the law degree in South Africa. Given the complexity of the course and the lack of appropriate support information resources, the failure rate is extremely high. Colleagues, I want you to visualize the pictures that are shown of the township school, the model school, and the private school, and visualize all of them sitting in one lecture hall. And you can then figure out who are the successful students and who are not. The prescribed textbooks are too expensive, and students try to get by without purchasing these prescribed textbooks. And we know the end result of that. So let me try to unpack this publication against the backdrop of issues that are raised during this presentation. So let me start off with the issue of equity. A large cohort of students are second language or later English speakers who have challenges navigating dense legal content. This book is written by students, for students, but under the guidance of an experienced tutor. The language is more understandable without compromising on academic rigor. The book is free, and that for me is another tick. So let me look at inclusion. And to continue with addressing the language challenge, this book is also available in audio format, which allows students to listen to the book before reading it. And you know, in Africa, oral culture is quite dominant. This feature makes the book more inclusive. It caters for different learning styles. It also caters for the oral culture. The visually impaired can also listen to the book without seeking appropriate software to support their learning. In South Africa, smartphones are more available than computers. Content can be viewed in HTML and EPUB, radically improving accessibility. I talked earlier on about leveling the playing field. Embedded in the textbook are many workbooks to help students prepare for the constitutional law examination. This may be viewed as a contradiction in terms of preparing students to write an exam, but that is what we considered in terms of this particular textbook. When this book was conceptualized, the assumption was that the book will be used across the country to assist with teaching and learning across South Africa. Let me switch to the next slide. As you could see in this slide, the number of downloads for the last 12 months. And if you look at July and September, in the month of September, which was basically last month, there were more than 15,000 downloads of this particular textbook. And what was most surprising was the fact that the book was downloaded in 73 countries. Even more surprising was the fact that the book was downloaded in a number of global north countries. An important lesson for us is that publishing open makes the book international and allows the book to be downloaded anywhere in the world. So I'm now going to look at the concept of development, the use of students who created the content. We are actually using that format to support the development of the next generation of academics. If you look at the concept of empowerment, the fact that the text is easily understandable serves to empower the citizens. So it's not only an OER for academic process. It is a text that every citizen could read and understand. And the rank and file can become familiar with their rights, consolidating, and this is important, consolidating South Africa's democracy. The constitutional law textbook, for me, ticks all the boxes. It supports an equitable and inclusive education. The textbook is free. The content is written in a language that resonates with students. It supports the demand for a decolonized curriculum. And important is this book is compliant. If I just go up, this book is compliant with a movement, with a purpose, a social justice purpose. It is testimony to an OER that is driven by social justice. The interchangeability of OERs as a teaching and learning tool and as a resource and as a source of research information makes it an extremely valuable resource in support of richer educational and research processes. We have seen the well-intended interventions and the conscious and unconscious biases derail a philanthropic movement. The transition from a movement with a purpose to a movement for a process has betrayed the global South and marginalized communities. There is a desperate need to recapture. We have to recapture that which has been lost in this transition. We need to resolve that safety nets must be constructed to ensure that OERs do not go down the same road that the cereal crisis has gone. For me, coming from the global south, the cereal crisis is much more of a crisis now than it ever was before. There has to be a commitment from all of us. There has to be a commitment from all of us to build these safety nets if the intention is to contribute to making open for all. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, fabulous. That was just incredible. Thank you so much for delivering that thought-provoking talk. There's so much to unpack. Audience, please put your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We can't pull them all out of the chat, so please do that. And please, put your applause in the chat, because it's the only way we can hear you. All right, so while the audience is putting some questions into the chat, I think you ended on such a powerful point about how us in the open education community can learn from this transition in the open access space from purpose to process. And you brought up the mention of safety nets and what we might be able to put in place to make sure that we don't go down that road. Can you expand a little bit on that concept and what you might see of what could have been done in the research side of things and what we might consider here?
Look, I think that, thanks, Nicole, for that. I think my take is that we need to take ownership and make sure that we have structures, we have commitment that ensures that we develop OERs in this particular instance and not rely on commercial publishers. I'm not in any way suggesting that we should be at loggerheads with the commercial publishers. We need to work in parallel, but at the same time, we need to ensure that if we want to develop a rich educational process, we need to take ownership of making sure that richness cuts across the entire learning population, not just the elite who can afford those rich texts. And for me, those safety nets are things that we need to put in place, an infrastructure. For me, it would be one. The second is a commitment to share. We talk about sharing. We make all these wonderful presentations. We make all of these wonderful commitments. But do we actually share? Do we share knowledge? Hey guys, I have done this. It worked for me. Please try it with you. We don't. And maybe this is the nature of higher education. We want to be the leading institution. I'm talking about myself. In South Africa, the University of Cape Town is the leading research university on the African continent. But how leading are we when it's only UCT staff and students that have learned this skill? So we're sharing the output, but are we sharing the skill so that we can teach other people to fish rather than give them the fish? And for me, those are the safety nets. Let's not rely on the commercial publishers. We need to take ownership. We need to ensure that we share, we develop infrastructure that facilitates the sharing and move forward in that particular way.
Thank you. And the concept of infrastructure was the major theme of the keynotes on Tuesday from Dr. Chan and Dr. Fitzpatrick. And I think this provides just a really powerful dimension on it, thinking about how we can learn from what has happened in the research space and apply that in open education. And there is a question in the Q&A about this distinction between process and purpose within the open access movement. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what exactly do you mean by purpose and process? And maybe we can unpack that a little bit to think about what the parallels to open education look like.
Okay. When I talk about a movement with a purpose, when we look at the Berlin Declaration, the Budapest Declaration, there was a distinct commitment that we want to share, and it's a bi-directional flow of information, of research information. That for me was a philanthropic purpose. We want to share for the sake of sharing, for the growth and development of society in general, and for me in Africa, the growth and development of the African continent. So there was a distinct purpose. So we're talking about sharing for humanity, for the development of society. And maybe because the process wasn't fast enough, the purpose was not achieving an exponential shift. We then sold our souls to a purpose, a process that would fast track the shift to open. So the process is basically taking the current subscription budgets and converting that to APC's budget. So it's a process of making more available open, but making more available open has had the opposite effect of being inclusive. So the process is well-meaning. We need to make more open. But the consequences of that process is alienation, the moving away from the purpose. So you're going to have one directional flow. The purpose talks about bi-directional flow. The process is now reinforcing one directional flow. I hope I have provided some level of clarity.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about how do we translate this to the open education space? Because it is the way that we publish and share open educational resources is very different than research publications, because in research, it's about publishing that sort of new, unique knowledge and getting access to be able to participate in the systems for sharing that knowledge. Whereas with education, it's about getting access to materials that are locally relevant and adaptable and customizable, and that can that learners can participate in shaping. And I don't think there's it's hard to know what the exact parallel is for APCs and transformative agreements. But I as an outsider of the open access movement, you know, I have seen this shift over the years where we've gone from talking about the ideal of how do we make research open for all to a conversation, should it be green OA or gold OA or diamond OA, which, you know, are completely opaque terms. And, you know, this new model of transformative agreements, you know, that even just that term reminds me of what's happening here in North America with what's called inclusive access, which is a model where universities and publishers negotiate for access to published educational materials that are then automatically billed to students, rather than taking the infrastructure approach of thinking about how do we build out content that can be you know, owned and governed by the institution. So just very interesting to think through these parallels. And I've seen a number of comments in the chat and in the questions about the challenges around sort of tenure and promotion and the incentives, especially here in North America, around impact factor and how that all plays into this, which is a challenge on both the research and education sides of things. So please go ahead.
For me, Nicole, I think it's a much easier road to traverse than the research articles, because you are now looking at all of those, for want of a better concept, fringe benefits of publishing your research article. But as an author, I write my book, right? It is at my university's cost, if that is, and then I pay the publisher to have it published. And the publisher makes the first cut before I get mine in terms of royalties. So it's easier in terms of OERs. I support OER so much that if I'm writing the content and I give it to my library, I'm talking on top of my, in my instance, and I give it to my library and ask them help me to publish it, there are so many less red tape to cut, to get through, than it is with the research articles because of all of what it brings with it. And I did see a chat from Glenda at UCT. They have embarked on this road of producing so many OERs. And they have taken ownership of this. Those materials now become accessible not only to the learning population in terms of students, but society in general. I mean, as a practicing doctor, you don't have to then look at developing your own hard copy collection or in getting involved in those huge subscriptions. But if you have access to those OERs, it gives you for more time than to contribute to the fact that you are a consumer. Hopefully, you will also become a contributor.
Mm-hmm. So we are running close to time and really only have time for one more question. So I'm going to read this one. In your talk, you mentioned that inclusion and exclusion are non-binary concepts. I make the connection between where you referred to as inclusionary interventions with exclusionary outcomes. If we don't address the material and epistemic exclusions that are happening with OER creation and adoption, we might be going down that path. Can you talk about how we can intentionally collaborate, facilitate more sharing, building processes and infrastructure that is more sustainable and empowering? And that's from Regina Gong.
Look, unfortunately, I'm going to give you an example. What we have done at the University of Cape Town, we have created the Continental Platform, a platform where any African university can use to publish their OERs, their journals, or whatever they want to publish. And we, as the university, we hold training sessions with other librarians, editors-in-chief, and prospective authors on how to use the platform to share their research or to write or manage a journal title. So in terms of our platform, we have a number of countries that have adopted the platform, and the Association of African Universities, and this is an association that basically links all universities across the continent. They have now adopted the platform. and are advocating that the rest of the continent use the platform to publish. So hopefully that will gain momentum. And the global north could look at us in Africa and say, here is an example that we can actually copy instead of us copying you.
Yes, and I think that that is such a wonderful point to end on, because I think there's so much more, across the open movements that we can be doing to have these kinds of conversations where we're exchanging knowledge across borders and across continents, and thinking about how can we address the challenges that we all face as humans, and help work toward that ideal of making open for all, and recognizing that knowledge is a human right, and we're all in this together. So unfortunately, we are out of time, but Dr. Raju, thank you so much for coming. This was an absolutely phenomenal talk, and I think really brought a lot to think about throughout the rest of today and the conference. We're so grateful that you took the time to be here, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for having me. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you very much.